Welcome to Module 4. We're going to be talking about administrative control and how that applies in a cloud-enabled world, specifically applying to the security aspects of a cloud-enabled world. So, jumping into it, we're on Module 4 here, and we're going to be covering a number of different topics. We're going to be going through these fairly quickly. Ultimately, the reason that we talk about administrative control is that when someone has administrative control of a cloud service or a cloud tenant, they have full control over the entire service and all the data hosted on it in almost every case. And losing control of this is a kind of a worst case scenario that we saw that happened to a cloud service provider. They were purchasing IaaS from another company, and they were providing a SaaS service. Well, this SaaS service, their administrative privileges to the backend IaaS service they were hosting their business on was compromised, and they lost control of that service. And so what ended up happening was the company ended up going out of business because the criminals that were attempting to extort money from them decided to delete all the data, which included their entire service and all of their customers' data. So this company called CodeSpaces ended up going bankrupt and out of business, and had very little recourse after everything was compromised, except for to provide a few refunds, as we understand it, after this. So we take administrative control of cloud tenants very seriously, because we do not want to see our customers in a position where they've lost administrative control of their tenants. So that's very, very critical. And we're going to be talking about control a lot, and I want to be very clear and explicit. We're not talking about security controls, which are safeguards such as preventive or detective controls. What we're talking about is administrative control, which is the ability to fully control the functions of a computer system, application, data, or a tenant. And so these aren't necessarily preventive measures or detective measures. These are, when we talk about administrative control, that's control of the service and assets and data. And when we look at these, we look through three different lenses. One of the things that Tim and I talked about quite a bit in a previous module was functional vulnerabilities, which are things that in the code of the logic that have to be corrected because they're in the original piece of software that was coded, but there's also potential to create vulnerabilities through a misconfiguration, such as using weak cryptography, using a weaker authentication scheme, incorrectly setting access control lists or ACLs. But there's also operational vulnerabilities. So using a sensitive credential on an insecure computer and exposing that credential to be stolen on that computer is an operational vulnerability. Clicking on a phishing email is an operational way of creating a risk. And obviously, the old standby of a password on a sticky note. These are all things that fit into the operational vulnerability. And so as we talk about this vulnerability, which is a potential means of control, we have to keep all of these in mind as we're looking at ways of losing administrative control or maintaining it and securing it. And one of the things that we strongly recommend is there's a session recording called How to Mitigate Pass the Hash and Other Forms of Credential Theft, and the link is here, that talks about how on-premise Active Directories are frequently compromised. And let me phrase that a little bit differently. It talks about the attack methods we frequently see used to compromise on-premise ADs. We can't talk to how many ADs are actually compromised, but the most popular method of doing so is pass the hash and credential theft. And so that is a good reference to look into. And you'll see ultimately cloud services are dependent on your on-premises identities. And so that's a very critical piece. So least privilege admin model. So it's very important to develop an administrative model and understand who should and shouldn't have admins and what permissions admin privileges and what privileges they should have, and how you're going to be monitoring those. And in this, you have to balance those usability and being able to get the job done with the least privilege. So they've got to be able to do their jobs, but with the least privilege possible. And you have to acknowledge the realities of the attack techniques that are available in the marketplace today. And of course, you have to capture that organization's intent so that you can measure and see if the permissions are sticking to this model over time. And the other thing about least privilege is that it's very important to think about it as an end state and not just taking permissions away. And to get to that end state, you have to really look at that, enabling someone to do their job with the least privilege possible. And so sometimes that means giving the privileges to someone else or consolidating them and then making those people that have the privileges accountable to do the job on behalf of it, on behalf of someone else. So someone requests that something gets done with, for example, domain admin privileges, and those domain admin privileges, the person that has those privileges has to accomplish that task in a specific set of time frame. Or you can provide those privileges on demand with a technical solution, such as the Microsoft Identity Manager, Privilege Access Management, or a number of other solutions on the market as well. And so providing them on demand technically is another way of reducing privileges. And so you really have to look at, even emergency access, so that if someone gets called in the middle of the night, hey, how do I get something done if I don't have the privileges? Well, we want to make sure that they have access to those, and well, guess what? It's in the safe, and so you can get it from the safe. And there's someone that, they're 24/7 that can get it out of the safe. So you really have to look at that end state and how do you get to the end state, more so than just simply taking the permissions away, meeting some resistance, and then backing off. You have to really think about enabling them to do their job. And a quick note here about Azure subscriptions. So in that tier model of tier 0, where the tier 0 is full control of the identities in the environment, such as domain admins, enterprise admins, we do have a recommendation that for high impact tier 0, like a production domain controller, we do recommend a separate subscription to ensure that because we found that for the most part, people that need a subscription admin in Azure are generally server admin level people, and they need it to be able to create VMs and deploy virtual machines and configure them and deploy virtual networks and the like. And most of those folks are not expected to be domain admins. But if you put a domain controller in there, they are effectively a domain admin because they have control over that virtual machine. And so for organizations that have extremely important identity stores like that, we do recommend a separate tier 0 subscription for those domain controllers, and there's tier 0 assets. And again, I refer to the Pass the Hash white paper version 2 to understand what that is and what the tier model is. But a separate server versus domain controller subscriptions is a key factor there. So the next piece that we look at is security dependencies. And a security dependency is anything that is in control of an asset. So if you look at Active Directory, Active Directory is ultimately in control of all accounts and all domain members. And the things that are potentially in control of Active Directory or could create a means of control of Active Directory is anything from an unpatched software vulnerability, a local OS administrator, which is the built-in administrator in AD, baseboard management controllers, anyone with physical access, anyone that has control of the installation media used to install a new DC, which malware could be implanted into, etc. And so there's all these means of control that create a security dependency. And as we look at cloud services, for example, Office 365, Azure Active Directory is automatically a security dependency of Office 365 because the identities that manage the service and therefore have control of all the mailboxes and data and tenant services, all of those are stored in Azure Active Directory. If you federate that from your on-premise Active Directory, both those federation and synchronization components as well as the AD itself are in control of your Office 365 instance. And of course, anything in control of them is also in that chain. And then wherever you administer that Azure AD or that Office 365 tenant from, and where you use those administrative credentials are also effectively in control of it. So you have to secure all those security dependencies at the level that you want the service to be secure at. And generally we find that the admin workstations are joined to the production Active Directory, which provides another link to the control of the tenant. Similar happens to Azure, assuming you're using Azure Active Directory for your identities in there, which, on the downstream side is control of all the IaaS VMs and all the tenant services, the availability of them, and of course control of any PaaS VM apps and data. And a very similar chain of events plays out here. So it's very important to keep in mind that the security of your on-premise environment has a significant impact on the security of your cloud services. So a very key point to keep in mind is that you do have to have your security house in order across the board. So strong authentication, there's a couple forms of this, and the first one is multi-factor, which multi-factor authentication is authenticating and proving that you have possession of any one of the following factors. So something you know, something you have, something you are. And multi-factor is basically having proof that you have possession of multiple of these factors. So 2 out of 3 or fairly rarely 3 out of 3. And so multi-factor authentication is a form of strong authentication, which is because a stolen password can't simply be reused at will. It's something that requires a stolen password plus something else, like a smart card or a phone or a hardware token. And there's some new forms of strong authentication in Windows 10 that I wanted to highlight very quickly. One is there's a new protocol called Microsoft Passport. It is public key based, unlike the current generation of symmetric key protocols. It is based on the FIDO Alliance standard, and actually I believe we've proposed to the FIDO Alliance a new version of the standard based on our learnings of implementing it. And it does use TPM hardware to protect the private key, so it is hardware bound and it is public key based, which is a significant new thing. And the key to this is that it is a new protocol, so the applications have to be brought up to have to be made compatible with it to a degree. Azure Active Directory and Active Directory will be supporting it. By the time of this recording, they may already have supported it. Windows Hello is a biometric way of unlocking those credentials, those Microsoft Passport credentials. So you simply show your face to a special camera that does an infrared check to make sure you can't just put a photograph of yourself up to the camera. Or you can do iris scans or fingerprint scans as well. That unlocks those new strong passport credentials. And additionally, the strong authentication that is also possible without having to change the protocol out is a feature called Credential Guard. And this takes your NTLM and your Kerberos credentials and protects those with with TPM hardware and puts those into a virtual secure mode or VSM construct that protects those credentials from theft on the client. So all of these strengthen the authentication, which are recommended very strongly for administrative accounts. Multi-factor as well as those new Windows 10 features. As well as any traditional smart card authentication is also very strong as well. The next piece is dedicated admin accounts and workstations. This is a very important part of achieving a very strong set of clouds, really any security for both very powerful on-premise administrative accounts as well as cloud tenant accounts. And the reason for this is any administrator or system process on a host. So if I'm running something as an admin, I can steal all the secrets and credentials entrusted to it. Now the exception here is if you have Passport or Credential Guard, I can't steal those credentials. However, if I am an admin on that box, I can take over any running session. I can impersonate someone that's logged into the machine. I can steal or alter any data on that machine. I can capture keystrokes, including someone typing a PIN, and I can access any hardware like a smart card. So ultimately, if I have control of a machine where an admin is logging in, I can impersonate that admin and do things as that admin. And so for that reason, we do recommend a separate admin workstation. And the reason for this is in most cases, standard desktops are controlled by a lower tier admin, such as a help desk admin or a workstation admin. And if a server admin or a domain admin or a cloud admin logs into there, then that lower tier admin, that server, that help desk or workstation admin can elevate themselves by stealing credentials or impersonating those higher privilege accounts. And it's not so much the legit admins that we worry about. We do worry about them, but more so we worry about the adversary that's impersonating and acting as that lower tier admin and impersonating them and using a stolen credential for them. So this is something that we worry about significantly, and it's a strong recommendation to have an admin workstation. And when we say admin workstation, there's a couple different variations on it. The first is the most obvious, which is dedicated hardware. And we do recommend this for high impact roles. We find that it tends to change people's behavior when they have a separate physical workstation. And it does give really strong signals for people to change their behavior and treat this as a special machine. And so we really like it for those very high impact roles like a domain admin or a tenant admin of all of your production Azure resources or Office 365 resources. Anything that has a very high business impact, this is a good solution for that. The other option that you can employ, and you have to be very careful about this, is you can use a single piece of hardware for both user and admin functions and perform dual functions with it. But you have to make sure that the admin operating system is in control of the user operating system and not the other way around. You don't want to have the user session being in control of the admin. So you would never put an admin VM on a regular user workstation, but you could put a regular user VM on an admin workstation. And you can also accomplish pretty much the same thing through remote desktop services or VDI solutions or a remote app or Azure remote app for the user functionality. And then the third piece is that for occasional use or remote or emergency use, or we've even seen it for daily use in some organizations, having a USB admin operating system that you can plug into any piece of hardware. We find this is really great for hurricane-prone areas to have every admin have that so they can use their home machine when they need to. But that's also an option for providing dedicated admin workstations. So, security standards. The thing I wanted to cover here is that you really want to establish a set of security standards that, especially in the admin world, most especially in the admin world, that say this is not just the roles of what people do, but it's also this is how they should behave. These are the operational standards that say these guys, these domain admins never log into a regular server. They never log into a regular workstation. Service accounts have to be configured in a certain way. You know, all of those things that could grant administrative control, if you have explicit guidance that says this is safe, this is not safe, it's a lot easier for folks to be able to operate successfully and to configure things successfully. So having those stringent security standards is a very key aspect. Monitoring and alerting is fairly obvious. You want to make sure that you're providing and significant monitoring and alerting of these accounts given the impact that they have inside the organization. And so that's a very key aspect. And then we also want to educate and empower the admins. We want to make sure that every single person that has privileges that could impact the business of the organization is very aware of the risks of they're very aware of the potential impact if someone got a hold of their credentials or if they got tricked or if they got phished. This is how important it is to be an admin. This is the damage and the impact you could have on the organization. And this is how to do things right. Here's the standards that tell you how to do things right. So it's very important to make sure those admins are educated on the impact of what they're doing so they understand why they need to treat their admin account special. They need to know what to do, and they need to know how to do it to be successful. And if you have that why, what, how, you have a very good linkage and a very good chance of them behaving in the way that you want them to and following the right processes and procedures. So in summary, the cloud administrative control really is dependent on your on-premise security in most enterprise cases, especially in the federated authentication case. And If you're already in the cloud, you definitely want to start focusing your security on those administrative controls, those dedicated admin workstations, the dedicated separate admin accounts, and those logging and response processes, and make sure that you're responding to any anomalous events. So admin control is extremely important in this cloud-enabled world. It's extremely important on-premise and in the cloud. And it's just critical to get all of those protections right and to make sure that those admin credentials don't fall into the wrong hands and those privileges don't fall into the wrong hands. And so that is the administrative control module, and we will see you in Module 5.